The call came at 6:47 in the evening, and nothing after that moment was ever the same. I was on Cascade Road, windows down, heading home after picking up a few things from the pharmacy. Ordinary evening, the kind where nothing feels like it could go wrong. Then my phone lit up on the seat beside me, and the name on the screen stopped my breath before I even answered. Eula Sampson did not call me in the evenings. Not ever. Her voice was wrong before she finished my name. Tight. Controlled in the way people get when they are trying not to fall apart. She told me my father and my daughter had been taken to Grady Memorial by ambulance, both of them, together. Then she said something that I did not fully register until much later. I tried Othniel first. He didn't pick up for me either. My name is Corianne. I have been many things in this life: a daughter, a mother, a wife. I have always believed that the people I loved were exactly who they showed me. That evening on Cascade Road was the last moment I believed that. I pulled over. My hands were steadier than they had any right to be. I called my husband. He answered on the second ring. His voice was warm, unhurried, the same voice that had said good morning to me for 14 years across the same kitchen table. He told me he was already at the hospital. He told me to take my time. Drive carefully, Corey. Everything is going to be fine. I exhaled. I pulled back into traffic. That voice carried me the entire 20 minutes to Grady Memorial. I was frightened, but I was not alone. Othniel was already there. He had handled it. That was what he did. He handled things. It was one of the reasons I had loved him without question for 14 years. If you are just finding this story, stay with me. Drop a comment and tell me what time you are watching. I read every single one. The emergency desk was busy. A nurse in her mid-40s looked up when I gave my name. Efficient, not unkind. The kind of woman who had delivered difficult news so many times it lived in the lines around her mouth. She looked at her screen. Then she looked at me. And there was a pause. 1 second, maybe less, that landed somewhere in my chest before she even opened her mouth. "You're the first family member to arrive, ma'am. We've been trying to reach your husband for the last hour. He hasn't been picking up." I did not move. I did not let a single thing cross my face. I thanked her. I asked for my father's room number and my daughter's. I walked down that corridor the way I walk into every room, straight, composed, 1 foot in front of the other. Nobody watching me would have seen anything break. But inside, I was doing something I had never done before in 14 years of marriage. I was replaying his voice, the exact warmth of it, the unhurried ease, and I was measuring it against what was true. Take your time. I'm already here. Everything is going to be fine. He had answered on the second ring, not the fourth, not after a delay. The second ring. A man sitting in a hospital waiting room waiting for news about his father-in-law and his stepdaughter answers a call from his wife on the second ring. A man who was never there answers the same way. I pushed through the door to my father's room. Gideon Cobb, 104 years old, the man who built everything our family stood on, was lying in that hospital bed with his eyes closed. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him look, diminished in a way that made something in me go very quiet. I sat down beside him. I took his hand. And the question that arrived, quiet, precise, impossible to push back down, was not where is my husband? It was why did he lie? He walked through those hospital doors looking exactly like a husband should. 40 minutes after I arrived. 40 minutes of sitting alone in that corridor between my father's room and my daughter's room. 2 doors apart, my hands folded in my lap, speaking to no one about the thing the nurse had told me. 40 minutes of watching the entrance every time it opened. And then, there he was. Othniel moved through the doorway the way he moved through every room, with quiet authority, his face carrying just the right measure of worry. Not frantic, not guilty, controlled. The face of a man who had received terrible news and driven straight there. He crossed the floor and pulled me into his arms before I could say a word. His explanation came while he was still holding me. A meeting that ran long. Phone on silent. He had been in a closed-door session and did not feel it vibrating. The moment he saw the missed calls, he got in the car. His voice was even. No stumbling. No over-explanation. He said it the way a man says something true. I let him hold me. For 1 second, just one, I almost let myself believe him. Not because the story made sense, because I wanted it to. Because my father was lying in one room and my daughter was lying in another, and I was tired and frightened. And 14 years is a long time to stop trusting somebody in a single evening. Then the nurse's words returned. You're the first family member to arrive, and whatever part of me wanted the easy answer went quiet again. I said nothing about the nurse, nothing about the hour I had spent alone. I pressed my face against his shoulder and I listened to every word he said, and I stored each one somewhere I could find it later. He went to Gideon's room first. I followed and stood in the doorway watching him sit on the edge of that bed, take my father's hand, speak to him in a low, steady voice. My father's eyes were open by then, glassy, exhausted, but open. Othniel leaned close and said something I could not hear. Whatever it was made the attending physician nod approvingly when Othniel turned to speak with him next. He asked the right questions. Medication adjustments, monitoring timeline, who to call if anything changed overnight. The nurses warmed to him within minutes. A woman from my cousin's side who had arrived and stood beside me touched my arm and said, "You are so lucky to have him, Corianne." I smiled, I nodded, I watched. Later, the two of us stood alone for a moment in the corridor outside Chanel's room. She was sedated, resting, the color returning slowly to her face. Othniel stood close to me and spoke in the quiet, measured tone he used when he wanted me to feel reassured. He said not to worry, that these things happened with men Gideon's age, that the important thing was he was stable, that Chanel was young and strong, that by morning everything would look different. His tone was precise, almost clinical in its reassurance, like a man reciting the correct words rather than finding them. I looked at him while he spoke, not at his face, at his hands. In 14 years, I had watched those hands in every kind of moment. Reaching for me across a dark room, gripping a steering wheel in traffic, pressing flat against a table during a difficult conversation. Othniel's hands always told me something his face did not. They were completely still, not clasped, not pressed together, not one thumb working against the other the way hands move when a person is carrying fear they cannot put down. His hands were at his sides, loose, easy, the hands of a man at rest inside himself. I drove home alone. I told him I needed the quiet, and he did not argue. He kissed my forehead and told me to get some sleep. On the drive, I went through every moment of the last 4 hours, the way you press a bruise. Deliberately, to understand the shape of the damage, the warmth on the phone, the 40-minute delay, the right questions, the still hands, the too precise reassurance. I did not know yet what I was looking for, but somewhere between that hospital and my front door, I understood that I had already started looking. I told Othniel I was going home ahead of him to pack a bag for my father. That was true. It was not the only reason. The house was dark when I got there. I did not turn on a single light. I sat down in front of the camera monitor in the study and I pulled up the footage from that morning with the same stillness I had carried through that hospital corridor. The kind of stillness that is not peace. It is control. There is a difference. 2 years ago, Chanel gave me a home security system for my birthday. Motion-activated cameras, cloud backup, the whole setup. She installed it herself, walked me through every function, made me promise I would actually use it. The system synced automatically to cloud storage every 90 minutes. I had never once thought about that sync schedule until tonight. I opened the morning footage. The gap was immediate. Unmistakable. Everything from 10:47 a.m. onward had been wiped from the local drive. Not a power failure. Not a glitch. The footage before that timestamp was intact and clean. What came after was simply gone. A flat, empty line where hours of recording should have been. Someone had deleted it deliberately. My hands were nothing like Othniel's. They were not still. I pressed them together in my lap and waited for them to settle while I thought about the one thing that mattered: the cloud. The system had completed its last automatic sync at 11:52 a.m. before the local drive was wiped. Anything the cameras captured before that upload was still sitting in the cloud, untouched, exactly where Chanel's system had put it. I accessed the cloud backup and the recovered window opened. 3 fragments. 41 seconds of footage total. Motion activated, not continuous, which was why the clips were short. I opened the first one. Timestamp, 11:14 a.m. A figure entering my father's front door. I leaned forward. I watched it twice. The shape was clear enough, a man moving with purpose, no hesitation at the door. Someone who knew the layout. Someone who had been told what to expect. It was not Othniel. It was no one I had ever seen in my life. I sat with that for a moment. Then I opened the second fragment. 6 seconds of motion in the kitchen, a shape near the side cabinet, partially obscured by the angle, something in his hands that the frame cut away from before I could identify it. Then, fragment 3. 4 seconds. My father's face. Gideon was seated in his chair. His color was wrong. His eyes were wide and confused and frightened in a way I had never seen on that face in my entire life. Not in all 104 years of it. His mouth was moving. No audio. Just his lips forming words to someone standing off camera. I watched it once. I watched it again. I watched it 30 times. I lost count of how many times I stopped it, backed it up, let it play. At first, I thought he was saying one thing, then another. The footage was too short. The angle was imperfect, but one possibility kept returning every time I watched it. 2 words. He's lying. I could not prove that was what he said. I knew that. But after the 20th viewing, I could not convince myself it was anything else either. I sat back from the screen. The room was still dark. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street and its headlights swept across the ceiling and disappeared. I sat in that darkness and I thought about 14 years of mornings. Notes left on the coffee pot before I was awake. His hand finding mine in the pew every Sunday without being asked. Every visit to my father, always voluntary, always warm, never once because I requested it. I thought about what a man of 104 years has to be absolutely certain of before fear changes his face that completely. I did not call Othniel. I did not call Chanel. I closed the application. I went upstairs and packed my father's bag. And before I left, I copied all 3 fragments onto a small drive and put it in the bottom of my handbag. Not as evidence. Not yet. As a beginning. 3 days after the ER night, I showed up at Eula Sampson's door with a covered dish and a thank you. Sweet potato casserole. Still warm. The kind of visit that needs no explanation in a neighborhood like this one. Just a woman returning a kindness the way we were raised to do. Nobody would have looked at it twice. Eula's house was exactly what it had always been. Photographs covering every surface. Decades of faces, graduations, grandchildren, a few people I recognized from the block going back 30 years. A clock on the mantel that ticked loud enough to fill the room. Something on the stove that smelled like onions and thyme. She took the dish from me with both hands and told me I did not have to do that, and I told her I wanted to. We sat in her front room. She asked about Gideon first, how he was resting, whether the doctors had given a clear picture yet. Then she asked about Chanel. I told her both of them were improving, and I watched the relief move across Eula's face, like something she had been holding back for 3 days, finally releasing. Eula Sampson had lived on that street for 30 years. She had a key to my father's house. She knew the sound of his television through the wall and the time he took his morning coffee, and the days his newspaper sat uncollected on the step because his hip was giving him trouble. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything and filed it without being asked. I let the conversation settle. Then I said, almost as an aside, the way you mentioned something that only just occurred to you, that I still did not have the full picture of that morning. Who had called? Who? What she had actually seen. She told it the way she did everything. Precisely. She had noticed a car outside Gideon's house around 11 that morning. She was coming back from checking her mailbox, and it caught her attention because she did not recognize it. Dark blue. Older, model, sedan. Not a vehicle she had ever seen on this street. She noted the time the way she noted everything, automatically, without deciding to. The car was gone when she looked again around 11:40. She thought nothing more of it until she went to check on Gideon around 12:30 and found his front door not fully closed. She pushed it open and called his name. I kept my face still and my hands loose in my lap while she described what she found. I did not rush her. I did not lean forward. She told me she had tried Othniel's number first. He was listed as the emergency contact on the sheet Gideon kept by the phone. He did not pick up. So she called me. Then she paused, set her cup down. There was something else she had not mentioned to anyone because she was not sure it mattered. The front room was not right when she walked in. She could not immediately say what was wrong, just that things were not where they belonged. And the side cabinet by the window, the one Gideon kept locked, always, without exception. The drawer was open, empty. I asked her one more question. I kept my voice at the same register as everything else in the conversation. Curious, casual, nothing more. Was there a smell in the house when you went in? Eula thought about it for a moment, then she said yes. Something underneath everything else. Sharp, chemical. She had assumed it was a cleaning product Gideon had used and left out somewhere. I nodded. I thanked her again. I picked up my purse. Walking to my car, I held two things side by side in my mind. The empty drawer. The smell Eula could not name. The same sharp chemical smell Chanel had mentioned 3 nights ago when she called me from her apartment, unable to sleep. Same house, same morning, same smell. And nobody in that emergency room had thought to ask why. Chanel had been home from the hospital for a week and she looked fine. That was the thing about my daughter. She had always known how to look fine. She got that from me. But she was waking at 3 in the morning, and when I asked her why, she could not explain it. Just an unease she could not locate. Something that pulled her out of sleep before she was ready and left her sitting in the dark of her apartment with no name for what she was feeling. I visited on a Wednesday afternoon. I brought nothing. No dish, no excuse. Just myself. We sat in her front room with tea and the television low. One of those afternoon programs neither of us was actually watching. The kind of afternoon that looks like nothing from the outside. Then Chanel set her cup down and said, "Mama, I keep smelling something and I don't know what it is." I kept my voice soft. I asked her to tell me about that morning. Not because I needed her to, because she needed to. There is a difference between a woman investigating and a mother listening, and I made sure she felt the second one. She started at the beginning, her key in Gideon's lock, the door swinging open. The smell hit her the moment she stepped inside, sharp and chemical, low in the air, underneath the familiar smell of her grandfather's house. She told herself he had used something to clean and left it out somewhere. She walked through the front room toward the sound of him. She heard him before she saw him, a sound she described as wrong. Not a word, not a call for help. Just a sound a person makes when their body is doing something it should not be doing. She found him in his chair, His color was bad. His breathing was shallow and irregular. She called 911 before she reached him. While she was on the call, the dizziness started. She told herself it was fear. She had never seen her grandfather like that. She sat on the floor beside his chair and kept talking to the dispatcher and told herself the room was not actually tilting. She paused, looked at her hands around her cup. Then she said, there was something else, something she had not remembered until 2 nights ago, when it surfaced at 3 a.m. and would not leave her alone. Before she reached her grandfather, in the space between stepping into the front room and crossing to his chair, she heard a door. Not the front door she had come through. The back. The distinct sound of a door being pulled shut from the other side. Someone leaving. I set my cup down carefully. I asked if she had seen anything. She shook her head. Just the sound. Then she added something in the quiet way she said the things that mattered most. And the drawer was open, Mama. The locked one. She had noticed it in passing. The way you notice something that has never been different suddenly being different. Her grandfather had shown her that drawer when she was a small girl, taken her hand and pointed to it, and told her that was where he kept the things that mattered most. In 60 years, she had never once seen it open. That morning, it was open and empty. I did not say anything. I reached over and put my hand on top of hers, and we sat there for a moment with the television still low in the background. On the drive home, I laid it out in my mind the way you lay cards on a table. Eula's unrecognized car outside at 11. The back door pulled shut from the other side. The locked drawer standing open and empty. The sharp chemical smell that had put my daughter on a hospital floor without either of us understanding why. One person, one morning, one clear purpose, and my husband's phone had been silent through all of it. I did not walk into Grady Memorial and ask for Brunel Dupree by name. That is not how a woman who is paying attention moves. I went first to Livette Greer, a hospital administrator I had known for 20 years, the kind of woman who understood the difference between a question and a request. I told her I was a mother trying to understand what had happened to my daughter medically, and that I needed a quiet conversation with the right person. Professional to professional, nothing official. Livette asked one question. Had Chanel authorized anyone to discuss her care? By the time I left her office that afternoon, Chanel had signed the release herself. She thought I was trying to understand why both she and Gideon ended up in the emergency room on the same day. That part, at least, was true. Livette made one call. Brunel Dupree agreed to meet. We sat at a corner table in a coffee shop 4 blocks from the hospital on a Tuesday morning. Brunel was younger than I expected. Early 30s. Precise in the way people are precise when they have trained themselves to observe carefully and speak carefully and never say more than they can stand behind. She told me at the outset that she could not speak in any official capacity beyond what had already been documented in the chart. What she could do, with Chanel's authorization on file, was explain what she had documented and why. I told her that was all I was asking for. She described Chanel's presentation the night of the incident with the same economy she probably used in her charts. The dizziness, the disorientation, the nausea, the brief loss of coordination. She had initiated the standard protocol for acute stress response, the kind of presentation commonly seen in people experiencing sudden trauma or shock. Then she stopped, set her cup down. She said, I wrote a note in the chart. I don't know if anyone followed up on it. I kept my hands still and my face open. The note flagged the presentation as atypical for pure stress response. The symptom pattern, particularly the coordination loss and the speed of onset, raised the possibility of something beyond emotional shock, not proof, not a diagnosis, a possibility. She documented it because documenting unusual findings was her job. She recommended further evaluation if symptoms recurred. They never did. Chanel recovered fully within 48 hours. No recurrence. The note remained in the chart, and the case moved no further. I asked her one question. I framed it carefully. As a family trying to understand a possible exposure, what kinds of things could cause symptoms like that? Brunel considered the question before answering. Then she described broad categories rather than specific substances. Environmental exposures, industrial solvents, cleaning compounds, fumes. A number of things could potentially produce similar symptoms under the right conditions, especially in enclosed environments. She was careful not to overstate what she knew. She said the same symptoms could appear in multiple situations, and that medicine worked by eliminating possibilities rather than guessing. Then she added something else. If an exposure had occurred and resolved quickly, proving it afterward would be difficult. Many compounds dissipate rapidly. Some leave little or no biological evidence after enough time passes, particularly when nobody has a reason to test for them in the first place. I stood to leave. Brunel asked, quietly, without pressure, what this was actually about. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, I am trying to understand what happened in my father's house. The word happened sat between us on that table. Brunel did not look away. She said, the note is still in the chart. It is a matter of record, filed under my name and my credentials. If anyone ever needs to review the case, it will still be there. I understood what she was telling me. She was not offering conclusions. She was telling me that what she observed had been documented at the time and preserved exactly as she recorded it. That mattered. Before we parted, she suggested I speak with Livette if I needed help locating independent testing resources outside the hospital system. Nothing more. No recommendations. No names. No shortcuts. Later that afternoon, Livette provided a short list of private laboratories that accepted civilian submissions without physician referrals. I folded the paper and placed it in my purse. I already knew what sample I was going to submit. 3 days after the ER night, I had gone back to my father's house alone and scraped residue from the inside surface of that empty drawer into a small sealed container. I had not told anyone. I had not even been certain why I was doing it at the time. Now I was. 3.5 weeks after the night everything changed, I made smothered chicken and rice and set it on the kitchen table like it was any other evening. The television was off. That was the only thing different. Othniel noticed, but said nothing about it. He sat down, filled his plate, asked about my day. I told him. He told me about his. We ate the way we had eaten 1,000 times in that kitchen, close enough to touch, far enough apart that neither of us had to. I waited until he had finished, until his fork was down and his plate was clean, and the moment was as ordinary as I could make it. Then I asked him where he was the morning my father and Chanel went to the hospital. He did not flinch. He did not reach for his glass or shift in his chair. He set his napkin on the table and looked at me the way a man looks at his wife when she asks him something he has already thought about. He told me about the real estate attorney, an investment property matter he had been quietly managing. Nothing significant, he said, just routine. The appointment had been scheduled 2 weeks in advance. After that, he had lunch downtown with a colleague at a restaurant on Peachtree. His phone was in his jacket pocket during both meetings. He had not felt it vibrating. When he came out of the restaurant and saw the missed calls, he drove straight to Grady. He told it evenly. No stumbling, no over-explanation, no careful pauses before the difficult parts. He told it the way a man tells something true because every piece of it was true. He had been at that attorney's office. He had eaten that lunch. The alibi was real, and he knew it, and I knew it. And the space between those two facts was where he believed he was completely safe. I asked him one question. What did you order at the restaurant? Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt, not alarm, just the faint satisfaction of a man who has the answer ready because the answer is real. He told me. Something specific. Something you remember because you actually sat there and ate it. I nodded. I picked up my plate. I said, I am glad you are okay. He watched me at the sink. After a moment, he said, Are you all right, Corey? I said, Just tired. He believed me. I heard it in the silence that followed. The particular quality of a man settling back into his own comfort, satisfied that the difficult thing had passed without consequence. I washed the dishes. I dried them. I put them away in the correct order the way I had done for 14 years in that kitchen. Then I told him I was going to take a bath and get some sleep. I sat on the bathroom floor with the door locked and wrote down everything he had said. The attorney's name, the colleague's name, the restaurant, the dish, every detail in the exact order he had delivered it. I wrote it the way you write something you intend to check, methodically, completely, without leaving gaps. A man with a clean alibi does not bother me. What bothers me is a man whose alibi is so clean it has no rough edges, no hesitation, no moment of having to remember. People who are telling the truth still have to remember. They pause, they correct themselves, they say, or maybe it was the other thing, I'm not sure. Othniel had been sure about everything. At 11 o'clock, I got in my car and drove 2 blocks from my house and called a number I had been holding for 3 weeks. Solvi Marsh answered on the second ring. I told her I was ready. She asked what I had. I listed it. The fragments, the deletion, the cloud sync, the car, the drawer, the residue sample, the medical note, and a husband whose alibi fit so perfectly it could only have been made before anyone asked for it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Come to my office, Thursday morning. Tell no one. Thursday morning, I parked 2 blocks from an address I had never visited and walked the rest of the way on foot. Solvi Marsh's office was in a part of the city I had no reason to know, which was precisely why I had chosen her. Nothing about my presence there could be traced to anything Othniel would recognize. I went in through the side entrance she had specified in her message. The office was nothing like I had imagined. No banks of screens, no dramatic equipment visible from the doorway. Just a clean desk, good lighting, and a woman who looked up from her work and assessed me in the time it takes most people to say hello. The way a surgeon looks at a patient before the first incision, not unkindly, but completely. She was already beginning to understand the shape of what I was carrying before I sat down. I gave her everything in the order I had prepared it. The drive with the 3 fragments, the drawer residue in the sealed container I had kept in the back of my closet for 2 weeks. The laboratory name Brunel had written on the card. Then I walked her through the full timeline, the deletion, the cloud sync, the unrecognized car, the empty drawer, the chemical smell, the medical note, the alibi and its suspicious perfection. No emotion, no interpretation. Just the facts in sequence. Solvi listened without moving. When I finished, she asked me 2 questions. Did he know I had the fragments? No. Did he know I had spoken to anyone? No. She nodded once and said, Good. Then she turned to her screen. She pulled up the camera system records from the drive and examined them in silence for several minutes. I counted. When she finally spoke, she did not look up. She said the deletion appeared deliberate, not a malfunction, not a power interruption, a deliberate remote deletion executed through a device authorized to access the camera system. The exact source would take longer to determine. She was careful about that. Attribution required records, preservation requests, and verification. But she was comfortable saying one thing immediately. Someone had intentionally removed the local footage. Then she explained something else. The local drive and the cloud backup were separate systems. Deleting one did not automatically affect the other, which meant the same thing it had meant the night I sat in front of that monitor. Whatever uploaded before the deletion remained untouched. She began the recovery. 20 minutes. I sat across from her and did not speak while she worked. The camera was motion activated, not continuous recording, which explained why the recovered footage totaled 41 seconds across 3 separate fragments rather than hours of unbroken footage. She opened each fragment and ran them without comment. The figure from the 11:14 a.m. clip was visible more clearly now. A man I did not recognize. He moved through my father's house with the ease of someone who had been told exactly what to expect. Straight to the side cabinet, no hesitation, no looking around. He knew the layout. He knew the target. He went directly to the locked drawer. I watched the footage 4 times. The man was not panicking. He was not rushing. He was executing a task with the calm of someone who had done similar work before and expected everything to go according to plan. That calm told me something more important than his face did. Whoever sent him had trusted him. While the recovery continued, Solvi noticed something else. Not evidence. Not yet. A possibility. The camera system appeared to share portions of its backup environment with other devices connected through the same home network configuration Chanel had originally installed. Solvi cautioned me immediately that possibilities were not proof. If relevant data existed, recovering it would require additional examination. Time. Documentation. Verification. Nothing useful would happen that day. But she wanted the possibility preserved. Before I left, she handed me a sheet of paper, not a name, a list. The next steps she wanted completed before she drew any conclusions. Laboratory testing, records requests, backup preservation, chain of custody documentation, the sort of list that made investigations slower and stronger at the same time. I folded the paper and put it in my handbag beside the drive. The footage had given us something real. Not answers. Not yet. But something better than suspicion. A man, a drawer, a purpose, and the certainty that whatever happened inside my father's house that morning had not happened by accident. I said, "Thank you." Then I walked out through the side entrance into the morning air. My father had been home from the hospital for 2 weeks when he finally told me. He was in his chair by the window. The same chair he had sat in for 30 years in that house, angled toward the street, the way he always kept it. The cardiologist had told us his pacemaker, fitted 3 years before, was the reason his rhythm had held through the worst of it. Without it, the outcome of that morning would have been different. I did not let myself think too long about that. I visited every other day. I brought food, straightened things, sat with him. We did not always talk. That had always been one of the truest things about my father. He never filled silence because he was uncomfortable. He filled it only when he had something worth putting in it. That afternoon, I arrived and found him looking out at the street, and I sat down across from him and we were quiet together for a long time. But the quality of the silence was different. It had weight. After a while, I understood that he was not simply resting. He was waiting for me to be ready. I told him, carefully, without the details, without the full shape of what I had been building for weeks, that I was looking into what happened that morning, that I needed to know if he had seen anything. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I saw him before." I kept my voice steady. I asked, "The man who came to the house?" He nodded. He did not know the man's name, but he had seen him once before, approximately 2 years ago. Gideon had been sitting in the back of a car outside a building on Peachtree, waiting for his ride, with nothing to do but watch the street. Othniel had been standing on the sidewalk, speaking with a man. What Gideon remembered was not the conversation. It was the argument. Not a loud one, not public, just sharp enough to catch attention. The man had thrown his hands up once in frustration. Othniel had stepped closer. Then the man had handed over a large envelope before walking away. The whole thing lasted less than a minute. But there was something unusual about the man. A pale scar running down the left side of his neck. Not dramatic, just distinctive enough to catch the eye. Gideon remembered noticing it because the man kept turning his head while he argued. That was what stayed with him. Not the face, the scar, When he later watched the recovered footage, the angle of the man's head exposed the same mark for a brief moment. The scar connected itself to the memory. I asked him why he had never told me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What was I going to tell you? That I saw your husband arguing with a man I didn't recognize 2 years ago." He said it without bitterness, just the plain weight of a man who had carried a feeling with nowhere to put it. Then he told me the thing he had been holding longest. 3 months before the ER night, Othniel had come to visit alone, which was not unusual. He came alone often, and brought papers for Gideon to look over. He called them investment documents, said it was just a routine matter, something to do with protecting the family's assets going forward. Gideon was tired that afternoon. Othniel was patient and familiar, and there in that chair across from him the way he had been for 14 years. Gideon signed 2 pages without reading them as carefully as he should have. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that Othniel had been bringing him a health drink for the past 2 years, said it was good for the heart. Gideon had been drinking it without question because Othniel was family, and there had never been a reason not to trust him. I kept my face completely still. I asked him to describe the papers. He remembered broad details rather than specific language. References to managing assets, authority to act on his behalf. Administrative language he had not paid close attention to because he believed Othniel's explanation. That was enough. I recognized the structure before he finished. Those papers had not been investment documents. They were almost certainly part of the authority transfer Sherwood and Solvey had been uncovering. I took my father's hand. I did not tell him exactly what I suspected. I simply held his hand and looked out the window at the street he had looked at for 50 years. He said, "I should have read them more carefully." I said, "You trusted your family. That is not a fault." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and looked at me with the full clarity of a man who has lived long enough to know exactly what he was asking. He said, "You're going to fix it, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, Daddy. I am going to fix it." 10 days after our first meeting, Solvey called and told me to come back. When I walked into her office, the desk was gone. In its place was a long table, and on that table were documents arranged in sequence from left to right. 14 years of paper laid out in the order it had been created. She did not greet me with anything except, "Start on the left." She walked me through it without editorializing. No commentary, no dramatic pauses. Just the facts in the order they occurred, beginning the week after my wedding. Not all of the records had come from the same place. Some had been pulled from public filings. Some came from documents Gideon kept in his house. Others had been obtained through formal requests made by counsel once enough irregularities had surfaced to justify looking deeper. The first item was a small account access change. A single authorized user added to a savings account connected to Gideon's property management. The kind of change that generates a one-line notification and nothing more. Individually, it meant nothing. Solvey moved to the next document. Then the next. 14 years of individually unremarkable adjustments that together formed something I had to step back from the table to fully see. A holding structure registered in a state with minimal reporting requirements. Incremental transfers routed through it in amounts small enough to avoid attracting attention. A revised will filed with the probate office 3 months ago, listing the holding structure as a primary beneficiary. And at the end of the sequence, 2 pages signed by a tired old man who had been told he was looking at investment documents. It was not dramatic. That was the thing that stayed with me as I stood at that table. It was not dramatic at all. It was patient, methodical. The work of a man who understood that 14 years of small, unremarkable actions would accumulate into something no single action could be held accountable for. I thought about every visit he had made to my father's house, every errand, every appointment he had attended without being asked. Every time someone in my family had turned to me and said how lucky I was. I had agreed with them. Every single time. I asked Solvi why we could not take what we had to the police. She was direct. A man with a real verifiable alibi, a 14-year marriage and no criminal history, walks into a police interview and his attorney reframes the entire document trail as a family estate matter handled informally between a son-in-law and an elderly father-in-law. Without the notary on record, the fraud still had alternative explanations a prosecutor would have to eliminate. We needed the notary. His name was Aldous Fenn, and his authentication stamp was on every document that mattered. Then, Solvi showed me what else her examination had produced. The message recovery had taken days. Most of the original records no longer existed. Some had been overwritten. Others had been deleted too completely to recover. The fragments that survived came from preserved cloud records, synchronized backups, and account records obtained through counsel after enough evidence existed to justify formal requests. The full conversation no longer existed, but enough remained. The surviving exchanges connected Othniel's account activity to an unregistered prepaid number across roughly 6 weeks before the ER incident. Most were incomplete. Timing, access, meeting locations, one reference to the drawer that confirmed the target. And then one message remained intact. Not because it had been preserved intentionally, because it had survived in multiple synchronized records after the sender failed to remove every copy. Sent from Othniel's registered account at 11:58 a.m. on the morning of the incident. 6 minutes after the cloud sync had completed and approximately 6 minutes after the man on that footage had left through my father's back door. Confirmed. Go to ground. Delete this thread. I photographed everything on that table. Every document, every transfer record, every surviving message. When I reached that final photograph, I looked at it for a long time. He had sent those words and then driven to a restaurant and ordered his lunch and sat across from a colleague and let his phone ring in his jacket pocket, while my father lay in cardiac distress and my daughter was on a hospital floor. I asked Solvi about divorce, whether ending the marriage was the cleaner path. She shook her head. Divorce dissolved a marriage. It did not unwind documents already filed with a probate court. It did not restore property already transferred through a holding structure. It did not stop mechanisms already in motion from continuing through other people. The only thing that restored what had been taken from my father was proving how it had been taken. And to do that, we still needed 2 people. One had authenticated documents he should never have authenticated. The other had walked into my father's house and opened that drawer. It took 11 days and a private investigator from Solvi's network to find Doretha Oakes. I used neither my name nor my connections. The investigator asked questions in the right places without explaining why. That was what I paid her for. I did not go to Doretha's home. I found her routine instead, a coffee shop on the west side she visited every Tuesday morning. Same table, same order, same time. I arrived 30 minutes before she did, and I chose the seat that faced the door. She was not what I had constructed in my mind during those 11 days. I do not know exactly what I had expected. What walked through that door was a woman in her mid-40s who moved with the particular self-containment of someone who had learned not to need a room's attention. She ordered at the counter without looking around. When she turned and saw me already watching her, something shifted in her face. Not fear, not guilt. Recognition of a kind. The way a woman recognizes a situation she has been half expecting without knowing it. She sat down across from me. I told her my first name only. I told her I believed we had someone in common. I told her I was not there to cause her harm, and that I was there because she deserved to know something. Then I slid a single document across the table. It was a bank statement. Solvi had pulled it during the financial recovery. The origin account of transfers made to Doretha over 2 years. Gideon Cobb's account number was printed clearly at the top. She looked at it for a long time, long enough that I stopped watching her face and looked at my own hands instead. When she finally spoke, she asked one question. How old is he? I said, 104. She did not speak again for almost a full minute. Then she looked back down at the statement. Not at the numbers. At the account name. When she finally raised her eyes, something had changed. Not shock. Recognition. The kind that arrives when a person suddenly understands they have been standing inside someone else's story without realizing it. I told her there were other records, documents she had a right to see if she chose to know more, but not today. Not unless she wanted to be involved. She sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, I need some time. She stood. She picked up her coffee. She walked out without looking back. I sat at that table alone for a few minutes. Then I left my card, name and number, under the edge of her saucer. 2 days later, she called. Her voice was not the voice of a woman who had spent 2 days deciding. It was the voice of a woman who had decided in that coffee shop and spent 2 days making sure the decision was something she could carry. There is a difference. She said, he told me the wife's family had money, that there would be a settlement eventually, that it was already arranged. He used your name once. He said you were the kind of woman who kept the peace. I said, he does not know me as well as he believed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I can see that now. A pause. Then, what do you need from me? I told her. Her testimony about the money, where it came from, what he had told her about it. Later that week, through Sherwood's office, she reviewed the additional records we had recovered. The holding structure, the revised will, the message sent while an ambulance was on its way to my father's house. By then, she had already made her decision. The documents simply confirmed it. She said, that is not all you need, but I will give you what I can. After the call, I sat in my car and allowed myself one moment that was not strategy. Doretha Oakes was supposed to be the loose end he controlled, the woman with enough exposure that her silence was guaranteed by her own self-interest. He had calculated her the way he had calculated everything, precisely and incorrectly. He had been wrong about what she would choose to protect. He had been wrong about me keeping the peace. He had been wrong about every woman in this story from the very beginning. Reaching Coswell Tate was not something I left to chance or feeling. Solvi and I spent 3 days mapping exactly what existed and exactly how to use it. She found 2 prior incidents connected to his name. Neither prosecuted, both documented in places that mattered. I authorized the approach. Sherwood Keynes made the contact through a channel that communicated one thing clearly without stating it directly. That his presence on recovered camera footage inside a house where a serious crime may have occurred was a conversation that would happen with or without his cooperation. He did not respond immediately. For nearly 2 days, there was nothing. Then, something changed. Later, Sherwood would tell me that Coswell had asked one question before agreeing to meet. Who else is on the footage? When he was told the recovered clips showed him entering the house and moving through it, but did not show Othniel anywhere on the property, he requested a meeting. Within 48 hours, he contacted Sherwood's office voluntarily. He came alone. Sherwood believed he had reached a conclusion before he ever walked through that door. If this investigation continued without him, he would be the only visible participant tied directly to that house. Othniel would remain a voice on a phone. Coswell would be the face on the footage. I was not in the room. I sat in Sherwood's waiting area with a cup of coffee I did not drink, and I listened to the silence on the other side of a closed door for just over an hour. Sherwood told me afterward. All of it. He had known Othniel for years through a prior arrangement, a document retrieval job 2 years earlier, clean and paid, and never spoken of again. The kind of transaction that established trust between men who operated in the margins of things. When Othniel contacted him 8 weeks before the ER incident, the instruction was the same category of work. Enter the house, retrieve documents from the locked drawer in the front room, leave no trace. He had done it before. He had no reason to expect this time would be different. That morning, he used a solvent on the drawer lock. The windows in the house were closed. He worked quickly. He was almost finished when Gideon came out of the back bedroom. The old man was not supposed to be in that part of the house at that hour. He saw Coswell. He stood in the doorway and said, "What are you doing in my house?" Then he moved toward him. Not aggressively. He was 104 years old. But the shock of it, the physical effort of rising and moving, the confrontation his body was not prepared for, his color changed within minutes. Coswell saw it happening. He said he did not touch him. Sherwood told me he said it twice, that he needed that understood. He did not touch Gideon Cobb, but he left. He walked out the back door and got into his car and drove away and left an old man in distress alone in a closed house. Then he sent Othniel a message describing what happened. Sherwood never told me the exact wording. What mattered was the response. Othniel told him to stay quiet and let things settle. Months passed. No payment ever arrived. No follow-up. No protection. Nothing. By the time Sherwood contacted him, Coswell had already begun to suspect he had been left carrying all of the risk. I sat with that in the waiting room after Sherwood went back inside. I thought about the words she had used. Campaign. Not incident. Not accident. Campaign. I thought about every visit Othniel had made to my father's house over 2 years, carrying something in his hands. The health drink. The supplements. Whatever he called it that week. And I let myself understand completely, and without looking away, what those visits had actually been for. Then I set it down. There was still work to do. Sherwood came back out and sat across from me. She laid out what we had. The recovered footage with Coswell visible, his voluntary statement, Doretha's financial account, Solvy's device trace on the deletion, the recovered messages, the estate documents, the fraudulent power of attorney. She said, "There is one piece left." I said, "Aldous Fenn." She said, "Yes. And then we go to the police." She paused. Then she said, "There is one more thing I need to show you tomorrow morning. Before Fenn arrives." The laboratory returned the residue results, and Solvy found something in the financial records about the medication. "We need to go through it together before anything else moves." I nodded. I picked up my bag. I had been waiting 4 months to hear those words. I could wait one more night. I arrived at Sherwood's office before Aldous Fenn was expected. Sherwood closed the door and placed 2 documents on the table without preamble. The first was the laboratory results from the drawer residue. The second was a supplemental financial report from Solvy, a cross-analysis of Gideon's pharmacy and supplement records against Othniel's personal purchase history across 3 years. The laboratory confirmed the solvent compound from the drawer surface. The specific category Brunel had described, commercially available, used in lock mechanisms, the kind that disperses in open air but persists in wood grain long after the biological detection window has closed. That part I had expected. I had collected that sample knowing what I was looking for. It was the second document that made Sherwood sit down before she began. She walked me through it quietly. Over 32 months, Othniel had made regular purchases from a nutritional supplier and a specialty pharmacy. The products themselves were not illegal. Most were marketed to people caring for aging relatives. At ordinary levels, they would not have raised concern. But Solvy had cross-referenced the purchase quantities against Gideon's documented health decline across the same period. The pattern that emerged was not ordinary. The purchases increased gradually over time. The timing tracked too closely with periods where Gideon's physicians had documented worsening fatigue, disrupted sleep, confusion, and declining stamina. None of it proved anything by itself. Sherwood was careful about that. A man of 104 can decline for many reasons. Doctors see that every day. More importantly, nobody could say with certainty what Gideon actually consumed, in what quantities, or for what reason. The records showed purchases, not administration, not intent, not causation. But when the purchases, The medical records and the timing were laid beside one another. The pattern became difficult to ignore. Solvi had taken the information, anonymized, with no names attached, to a cardiologist and a geriatric specialist for independent review. Their written observations were attached to the report. Neither physician claimed they could determine intent. Neither claimed the purchases proved wrongdoing. What they did say was that consistent use of those compounds in the quantities reflected by the purchase records could reasonably contribute to fatigue, disrupted sleep patterns, reduced resilience, and worsening cardiovascular stress in a patient matching Gideon's profile. One physician described the pattern as inconsistent with ordinary caregiving practices. The phrase was underlined: inconsistent with ordinary caregiving practices. I sat with that sentence longer than I should have. Sherwood did not speak. The camera deletion was a crime. The document fraud was a crime. But this, 32 months of purchases, timing, and unexplained decline surrounding a man who trusted completely, settled somewhere deeper inside me than either of those things. I asked Sherwood if it was enough for the criminal case. She shook her head slightly. Not by itself. The medical review established context. It established pattern. It established questions that investigators would want answered. Combined with the document fraud, the recovered messages, the camera deletion, and Coswell's testimony, it painted a picture prosecutors would take seriously. By itself, it raised concerns. Together, it raised something else. I understood. Aldous Fenn arrived at 10 o'clock. He came alone. No attorney beside him, no folder in his hands. I noted it immediately. A man who arrives without an attorney has already made his decision before he walks through the door. Sherwood led the conversation. I sat to the side and did not speak. He confirmed everything. The documents he had authenticated. The specific language Othniel had used. Careful, plausible language designed to give Fenn just enough professional comfort to proceed without pressing harder. The payment. The single meeting at a location chosen by Othniel. He admitted he had convinced himself the old man understood what he was signing. He said it without conviction. Then he placed something on the table that Sherwood had not known to ask for. Earlier documents. Versions of the same scheme brought to Fenn for authentication 6 months before the ER incident. Revisions he had refused because something about them felt wrong. He had kept copies without fully understanding why. They showed a pattern of escalation. Othniel had been attempting versions of this for longer than even the financial records had revealed. After Fenn left, I sat alone in that conference room. I looked at the date on the earliest refused document. I thought about where Othniel and I had been in our lives on that date, what we had been doing, what I had believed about us on that specific day. I did not cry. I simply sat with it until it became something I could carry. Sherwood came back in and sat across from me. She said, "We are ready." I asked, "How long before he knows?" She said, "We file with the police tomorrow morning. He will know within 24 hours. I nodded. Then I said, "I need one evening first. I need to sit across from him one more time before this leaves my hands." Sherwood looked at me for a moment. She said, "I cannot advise that." I said, "I know." I made smothered chicken and rice. The same thing I had made the evening I asked him what he ordered for lunch. The same kitchen, the same table, the same 2 seats across from each other that we had occupied for 14 years. I set his plate where I always set it. I put my car keys beside my own plate and sat down. He came home at his usual time. He hung his jacket. He washed his hands. He sat down and looked at the food and said it smelled good. He filled his glass and asked about my day, and I told him something ordinary, and he told me something ordinary, and we ate the way we had eaten 1,000 times. He was comfortable. That was the thing I had been counting on. 4 months of his wife being quiet had settled something in him. His alibi was clean. His scheme was running. As far as Othniel Hollins knew, he was completely safe in his own home, at his own table, eating a meal his wife had made him. I watched him from behind the face I had been wearing for 4 months. He did not notice the car keys. I waited until his plate was empty, until his glass was refilled and the moment had reached its most ordinary point. Then I reached beside my chair. I placed the first folder on the table, then the second, then the evidence drive, then the printed cloud backup sync record, then the deleted message thread, then the photograph of 4 words sent at 11:58 a.m. on the morning. My father's heart went into crisis. He looked at what was on the table. His face did not break immediately. He was too practiced for that. He picked up the sync record and read it with the careful attention of a man who was still, in those first seconds, looking for the exit. He set it down. He reached for his glass and his hand stopped before it got there. He started with the alibi. I let him. When he finished, I pointed to the sync record and I said, "I am not arguing about where you were. I am showing you what you did from wherever you were. A remote deletion executed from your registered device at 1:47 p.m. Then I told him that Sherwood Caines had filed everything with the Atlanta Police Department at 9 o'clock that morning. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. That morning. Before I came home. Before I turned on the stove. There was nothing left for him to reach or move or call. It was already done. He was quiet. I told him about Coswell Tate, what he said, where he said it, and that he said it voluntarily. I told him about Doretha Oakes and the bank statements showing my father's account number at the top. I told him about Aldous Fenn walking into Sherwood's office without an attorney and placing the earlier refused documents on the table. I told him about Solvey tracing the deletion to his registered device. I told him about Brunel Dupree's chart note and the laboratory confirming the solvent from the drawer surface. I told him about the supplement records and the cross-analysis and the cardiologist's report and the single word she had used. I told him about Eula Sampson, who had been noting the time for 30 years and saw a car she did not recognize parked outside my father's house. I told him about Chanel hearing the back door pulled shut from the other side. I told him about my father in his chair by the window, asking me, "You're going to fix it, aren't you?" His face stopped. Not all at once. The way a performance stops when the performer finally understands that the audience already knows. The composure did not shatter. It simply ceased to be maintained. What was underneath was not guilt, and it was not grief. It was the blank, specific stillness of a man who had accounted for every variable in a 14-year plan and had not accounted for the woman sitting across from him. He said my name, just my name. I looked at him. I said, "The attorney will be in touch." I stood. I picked up my car keys and the folder. I left the copies on the table. I walked to the door and I opened it and I stepped through it. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me that I needed. 6 months is a long time to carry something heavy. 6 months is also long enough for certain truths to stop being disputed. By early spring, the criminal case against Othniel Hollins was moving through the courts. The holding structure had already been frozen. The fraudulent power of attorney had been voided by the probate court pending final resolution, and every account connected to it was under court supervision. Gideon Cobb's property, accounts, and decision-making authority had been restored entirely to him while the remaining proceedings continued. Some matters were still working their way through attorneys, filings, and hearing dates. But the important thing was no longer in doubt. The documents had been exposed, the fraud had been stopped, and Gideon Cobb once again controlled what belonged to Gideon Cobb. On a Saturday morning in early spring, I drove to my father's house with no particular reason for the visit. The kind of morning that does not need one. I let myself in with my key. He was in his chair by the window, the same chair, the same angle toward the street. The morning light was coming in the way it always came in that room, across the floor in a long, pale stripe that reached almost to his feet. I stood in the doorway and looked at him, and something that had been held tight in my chest, since the night I sat in the dark, in front of that camera monitor, released itself quietly and completely. I went to the kitchen and made us both something warm. I brought it out and sat across from him, and we did not speak about Othniel. We did not speak about the case, or the courts, or the documents, or any of the machinery still turning slowly in the background. Those things belong to attorneys and judges, and they would resolve in their own time. This morning did not belong to any of that. We talked about my mother, about the early years in this house when the neighborhood was different and the streets had different names, and the corner store 2 blocks over was still run by the same family that had opened it in 1959. Gideon remembered it the way he remembered everything, in the specific, unhurried detail of a man who had been paying close attention for 104 years and saw no reason to stop. After a while, he looked at me and asked, "Are you all right? Not about the case, about me." The way a father asks who has known you long enough to know the difference. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said, "I will be." He nodded. He said, "Your mother would have handled it the same way." I said, "She would have handled it faster." He laughed. It was a small sound, quiet and unhurried, the way everything about Gideon Cobb was quiet and unhurried, but it filled that room completely, and I held on to it. Then he said he had been meaning to tell me something for weeks. The morning Coswell came into his house. He was not as frightened as I might imagine. He was angry. A very specific and very old anger. The kind that belongs to a man who has lived long enough to recognize a thing before it finishes arriving. He had known exactly what was happening. He simply could not stop it alone. I reached across and took his hand. I said, "You weren't alone. You just didn't know I was coming yet." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I knew. I raised you. I knew you were coming." I held his hand and looked out the window at the street he had looked out at for 50 years. The oak tree on the far corner that had been a sapling when he moved here. The house across the road that had changed hands 3 times while this one had not. The name on the deed inside. The name on the accounts. The name on everything that mattered. Cobb. As it was. As it would be. After a long, quiet moment, he spoke again. He looked out at the street first, and then he looked at me. He said, "They always think patience belongs to them." A pause. He said, "They never understand that we invented it."